Tumbling Towers by Bailation, Chapter 2.
11th of September, 2001, 8:49 a.m. The tea kettle on the stovetop whistled as Hermione turned on the television in the living room. The only reason she had bought one of the Muggle devices to keep herself connected with the Muggle world. She would watch both the morning and evening news every day, which Ron found quite amusing. He was fascinated by the Muggle things that Hermione brought, but he never really took them seriously as Hermione and Harry did. Hermione turned down the heat on the stove and poured herself a cup of tea. Just as she placed a piece of bread in the toaster, the voice of a newscaster on the television caused her to suddenly drop her cup, which shattered at her feet. We've just received breaking news from the U.S. Only moments ago, Flight 11 has crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. The plane has departed from Portland, Maine, and was scheduled to land in Boston, Massachusetts. American sources say this a sudden event could possibly be a terrorist attack. The rest of the world, from the newscaster, were lost to Hermione. The news station was showing footage of the current state of the North Tower. Black smoke billowed from where the plane had hit, and flames licked at the sides of the tower. So many thoughts were rushing through her head, making her weak in the knees and forcing her to sit down in the nearest chair. Ron was in New York. He had told her why he wouldn't be underground most of the time, but not all the time. Why hadn't she asked for more information? What if Ron had been above ground when the plane hit? What if, for whatever reason, he had been in the North Tower when it had hit? She felt panic set in. She stood up and, forcing her legs to work, rushed to the phone on the computer. Another Muggle contraption, Ron had said. But for now, she couldn't be happier than she had one. Hermione picked up the phone and realized she had no idea who to call. There was no way Ron was anywhere near a phone, as most of the Aurors didn't even know how to use one. Harry and Ginny also had a landline, but they wouldn't know where Ron was. Would they? Just as they dialing the number of Harry Potter, she glanced over at the television and gasped. A small explosion sudden appeared in the middle of the sub tower. In an instant, she realized she had looked in the time to see another plane hit the other tower. The newscaster was frantic, and Hermione could hear another panicked mutters from the people in the camera of the newsroom. Distress began to cloud her brain, and logic suddenly didn't make sense. She stopped thinking and frantically dialed Harry's number. It rang once, twice, 3 times, and finally, Harry's voice came from the other end of the line. Hello? Are you watching the news? Asked Hermione, her voice shaking with fright. She raised a trembling hand to her forehead and gripped at her hair. Yeah, I was just about to tell you. Harry sounded just as distressed as she felt. I'm trying to make connections with the ministry. They should be in contact with the Muggles in New York. Harry, where's Ron? Hermione interrupted, tears of panic now forming in her eyes. Do you know where in the city he was supposed to be today? Hermione! Harry sighed, and he felt her heart break, as if there was a confirmation of that Ron was dead. However, she bit her lip and stayed silent. Hermione, Ron told me they were supposed to be underground for most of the mission. But he also said that they would be above ground for part of the time to meet with some of the Muggle leaders to get information on the Death Eaters. He sighed again, and her heart beated even faster. I really don't know where he is, Hermione. I don't think there was a schedule either. I think they were planning it by ear. He could be anywhere. She gave a small gasp of agony and slammed the phone down. She looked over at the television again, which showed a full shot of the 2 smoking towers. She thought of Ron and the many possibilities of his current state. She looked down at her engagement ring and quickly decided to do what she needed to do. Hermione rushed to her bedroom and yanked open one of her drawers, pulling out the small beaded bag that she hadn't used in 3 years. She scrambled to the bathroom and dropped 5 different kinds of dittany into the bag. She opened the drawer and grabbed 2 rolls of gauze, stuffing them into the bag. She ran back into the bedroom and rifled through her drawer, finding her passport and dropping that into the bag as well. Hermione ran downstairs and grabbed her purse, dumping it into the beaded bag that still held an undetectable extension charm. Her purse held her cell phone and her wallet, along with all other necessities. She silently cursed Ron for ignoring her, and when she had advised him to get a cell phone as well. If he had gotten one, She could have simply called him to make sure he was all right. Lastly, she checked her pocket for her wand, withdrawing it as she spun on the spot to disapparate. Hermione appeared in the back alley of London, only 20 feet from the airport, as she had planned. She looked herself over for the splinching, and when she found herself wasn't any, she quickly pulled herself together and entered the airport. She found an empty ticket booth almost immediately and ran up to the person behind the counter.
I need one ticket to the next flight to New York, please.
The woman behind the counter shook her head.
I'm sorry, miss, but we've stopped all flights to the US for the time being due to the turmoil that's happening over there right now. There's no flights going to America?
Asked Hermione incredulously.
What's happening over there? It's not just New York. A plane just crashed into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. Just a few minutes ago, the Americans think it's a terrorist attack.
This was hard enough to process, but Hermione could hardly stop thinking about the whereabouts of Ron. So there's no possible way to get to America? No way at all? But she didn't care. The woman only looked at her with sympathy, as if she knew Hermione was looking for someone in New York.
I'm sorry, miss. God damn it!
Yelled Hermione, her patience now completely gone. She realized she referred to Ron as her husband, but she didn't care. He might as well have been.
What do you expect me to do? Sit home and hope he's not dead?
The woman was surprised, but before she could say anything, a security guard suddenly appeared next to Hermione.
Is there a problem, miss?
He looked at her sternly, and Hermione was able to contain her anger for the time being.
No, there's nothing wrong, he told the guard. Absolutely nothing.
And with that, she turned on her heels and left the airport. She returned to the alleyway, and which she had apparated, and ripped the bag off her body, throwing it against the wall. Thousands of thoughts were rushing through her head, but they all concluded that she needed to get to New York. She suddenly realized that she could apparate to America. Long ago, she had read that if one would apparate to a destination that's such a large distance away, they would be putting their life in danger. Hermione remembered the book saying that it was highly advised not to apparate between countries. For this, either muggle flying or portkeys were safer. She groaned out loud, running a hand through her hair. She was nowhere near any portkey, and she had never learned the spell that turned the object into a portkey. How stupid could she be? Since when did she pass up an opportunity to learn a spell? She was running out of time. Ron could either be dead or horribly injured, and Hermione knew about the only enough about Muggle buildings to know that those towers would eventually collapse, possibly killing more people. In an instant, she decided what to do. She picked up her bag and slung it around her body once more, and concentrated on apparition harder than she had ever done in her life.
Destination, destination, destination.
She turned and felt the familiar sensation, partially being squashed at all angles from her body. When she reappeared, the first thing she realized was that she was alive in an unknown alleyway, and she heard sirens from all around, and she knew she had to be in the right place, but something was very wrong. Excruciating pain brought her attention to her arm. She almost fainted at what she saw. A huge chunk of her forearm was missing, as if scooped away with a knife. Her arm now looked like a bloody, raw piece of meat. Never in her life had she splinched herself so badly, but she had expected worse, especially since apparating between countries was anticipated to kill her. She wished she could just lie down and allow the blood loss to put her to sleep, but she remembered Ron and kept her head with her She rifled through her bag and found the right bottle of Dittany. Then she knew she was supposed to reduce the pain and heal the wound. She shakily applied the right number of drops, wincing at the slight pain, and watched as the wound sizzled and smoked. New skin sewed itself over the wound as Hermione dug through her bag once more and found the gauze. She unwrapped the roll with one hand and tore a piece off with her teeth. She wrapped the piece with difficulty around her wound. As soon as she checked over the rest of her body to make sure she hadn't split anywhere else, she dumped the dittany and gauze into her bag and ran out the alleyway. What she saw next was absolutely devastating. In front of her, only a few blocks away, stood the 2 burning towers she had seen on her television in her flat in London. Ghostly looking, people were rushing past her, covered in debris and white dust and ash. Some of them were dragging along other injured bodies. The one thing that they all had in common was that every single one of their faces was filled with anguish. As crowds of people rushed past her, she started to run the opposite way, pushing herself against the throng. The towers began to get closer and closer, and Hermione became more frantic, as not one single person who was passing her looked like an Auror, or like Ron. Finally, she was within a block of the burning towers, and the air was thick with smoke. Hermione looked down and performed a spell to block the smoke around her mouth and nose. The muggles around her didn't seem to notice. They were too preoccupied with running from the thick clouds of smoke. Just as she was meters within the South Tower, she stopped. Was she really going to go in? To maybe find out that Ron wasn't in the building anyway? Made her mind up immediately, her hand on her waist, in her pocket, so the muggles couldn't see. Just as she was running toward the entrance to the tower, a hand grabbed her around the waist and pulled her back. Hermione! She knew that voice. Relief flooded her body as soon as she rounded and met the eyes of a very familiar redhead. Ron Weasley stood in front of her in his Auror uniform, which the people around him seemed too busy to question. He was so deeply covered in white dust that Hermione could hardly recognize him. Once she saw a clear layer of dirt, however, relieved, causing her to nearly faint. Ron! She flung her arms around him and sobbed into his shoulder, threading her fingers through his hair. He smelled of ash, but she inhaled every part of him, kissing him harder than she ever had. Ron seemed utterly startled to see her in New York. Hermione, what are you doing here? Why aren't you home? I saw the beggar playing it on TV. His own arms wrapped around her, stroking her hair and patting her back. He seemed to understand, despite her inability to form a sentence. She finally came back and Ron caught sight of her bandage arm. What happened? Who did that to you? No one! I splinged myself out right here from London. Probably shouldn't have done it. I needed to find you, Ron. She was cut off by a sudden tremble of the earth beneath their feet. They looked down and saw the earth was beginning to shake hard. She gripped Ron's arm and she wrapped it around his shoulders, holding him closer. Together, they looked up at the tower above them, and it dawned on them. At the same time, the building had been struck by a plane only an hour before it was beginning to collapse.